On my birthday, my son raised a glass and toasted to my final years. His wife smirked, already talking about turning my studio into her closet. The poison in my tea made every sip a countdown. I stayed quiet. I let them think I was fading. But at the Palmer Club, I stood tall, and they lost everything. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The golden light of chandeliers spilled across polished wood floors, casting a soft glow over the grand room where Eleanor Grant's 75th birthday unfolded. Crystal glasses chimed, silver forks traced porcelain plates, and polite laughter swelled in corners where old colleagues and distant relatives gathered. The evening was orchestrated by her son, Daniel, whose insistence on celebrating mother properly had been relentless. Eleanor had smiled as she always did, even as she felt her home slipping further away with each of Victoria's renovations. 40 years ago, she had designed this house herself, a sanctuary of light and space, every line an extension of her vision. Now, room by room, Victoria was quietly erasing her presence, draping over it a style that never belonged. Tonight, even as guests admired the elegant decor, Eleanor felt herself wandering inside a stranger's home. Excusing herself from a circle of well-meaning academics, she made her way down the hall, her legs heavy with the fatigue that had plagued her since Margaret's death 3 years earlier. That loss had hollowed her. It was in that hollow space Daniel had stepped, first with kindness, then with control. She had not noticed the shift until it was too late. As she passed the study, voices spilled into the corridor, soft and conspiratorial. She paused. "I hope this is her last birthday." Victoria's laugh tinkled like ice against glass. Eleanor froze, one hand steadying against the wall. "I've already imagined how her studio will make the most magnificent closet." For a moment, the world tilted. She gripped the plaster beneath her palm, fighting the sudden rush of nausea. "Patience, darling," Daniel's voice followed. "Calm and clinical. The doctor says her heart won't last much longer. When it happens, everything becomes officially ours." The sound of glasses clinking sealed the moment. Laughter followed. Low, satisfied, certain. Eleanor straightened, her breath measured, her face arranging itself into the neutral mask she had perfected during decades spent in boardrooms filled with men who doubted her. She turned away, each step deliberate, returning to her guests with the grace of a woman who had built skyscrapers from imagination and steel. Later, Daniel lifted his glass. "To the best mother a son could ask for," he declared, smiling broadly, pride masking resentment. For years he had struggled against her shadow, recoiling when magazines praised him only as Eleanor Grant's son. Tonight his words rang hollow, sweetened for an audience too distracted to see the fracture in his smile. Eleanor clinked her glass against the nearest one, lips curved in polite acknowledgement. Inside, however, a clarity settled over her like sharpened glass. She saw the truth. The careful control Daniel had built since Margaret's passing, the way he had taken over her technology, then her finances, and finally her medication. Pills she swallowed dutifully under his watchful eye, trusting his concern for her failing heart. That night, when the last of the guests had departed and the house sank into silence, Eleanor lay awake in her bed. Shadows shifted across the ceiling, whispering of betrayals now too clear to ignore. Daniel's ambition, she realized, was not born from love, but from the same resentment her late husband once carried, a bitterness toward her success, her strength, her survival. Dawn crept pale through the windows as she watched Daniel and Victoria leave for their routines, their laughter floating faintly through the morning air. When Helen entered with a breakfast tray, Eleanor motioned her closer. Helen Brooks had been more than a housekeeper for 30 years. She had been a companion through illness and grief, a silent witness to triumphs and tragedies. "I need to tell you something terrible," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "And I need your help." Helen's eyes softened with the weight of understanding before Eleanor had finished explaining. "Mrs. Grant," she said firmly, "I've seen the changes in your medications. I've suspected something was wrong for months. Whatever you need, I'm with you." For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something stir. Not despair, not fear, but the faint ignition of purpose. Later that morning, alone in her studio where the faint scent of drafting paper lingered, she picked up the phone. Her hand trembled as she dialed a number she had not called in nearly a decade. The line clicked, and a familiar voice answered, still deep, still steady. This is Richard Alvarez. Her throat constricted, decades of silence pressing heavy. Richard, she whispered. It's Eleanor. Silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken history filling the line. Once, long ago, they had stood on the edge of both love and revolution, their shared vision for a sustainable urban complex unfinished when she chose family over him. Now family had betrayed her. I need your help, she said, the words breaking through the years. And I think you'll want to hear what I have to say about the Urban Hub project. She could almost hear his posture shift, old fire rekindling. I'm listening. For the first time since discovering Margaret's cold body on that dreadful morning 3 years ago, Eleanor felt a pulse of life return. Not just anger, but purpose. Not just betrayal, but design. Her battle had begun. The morning air carried a sharp chill as Eleanor sat by her studio window, the city skyline blurred in the distance. Her hands trembled faintly as she held her teacup, though not from weakness alone. Rage had a way of making the body betray itself. Daniel believed her too frail to notice his manipulations, too weary to question the pills he pressed into her palm each morning. He had mistaken her grief for blindness. When Helen returned with a second pot of tea, Eleanor motioned for her to close the door. The moment the latch clicked, Eleanor pulled a small notebook from beneath her sketching table. The worn leather cover opened to reveal Helen's meticulous handwriting, rows of dates, descriptions of pills, and the changes that had aligned with Eleanor's worsening symptoms. The labels don't match what was inside, Helen whispered. I started writing everything down 8 months ago, after each prescription seemed to make you weaker. The confusion, the tremors, the heaviness in your legs, it all began after Daniel insisted on switching doctors. Eleanor pressed her hand against the pages, her throat tightening. You risked your position for this. Helen shook her head. When my husband died and Alicia needed college tuition, you didn't offer a loan. You gave us a scholarship in his name. Some loyalties can't be bought, Mrs. Grant, and they've been paying me extra to report your so-called confused behaviors. But I've been telling them what they want to hear instead. The betrayal burned hotter now. Daniel had paid for deceit inside her own home. But standing across from her, Helen's loyalty felt like a lifeline. That afternoon, Eleanor picked up an untraceable phone Helen had discreetly procured. Her fingers hesitated only once before dialing. The line crackled, then a familiar voice answered. Eleanor Grant, Dr. Edward Clark said, warm and surprised. It's been too long. Daniel told me you wanted all your care managed through Dr. Hale. I had no idea. I need your help, Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady despite the dread rising in her chest. I believe I'm being poisoned. There was a pause, then a sharp inhale. Where can we meet? They arranged to meet at a colleague's private practice on the outskirts of Evanston. Helen drove her, slipping Eleanor through a side entrance while Daniel believed she was asleep upstairs. Dr. Clark examined her carefully, his brow furrowed with concern. Your heart is strong, Eleanor, very strong. What you're describing, the tremors, the confusion, the weakness, these aren't signs of heart failure. They're consistent with anticholinergic toxicity and possibly benzodiazepine overdose. The words fell like stones, solid and undeniable. I'll need to report this, he said gravely. Not yet, she whispered. If Daniel suspects I know, he'll accelerate whatever plan he has. I need time, 3 weeks at least. Long enough to prepare legal protection, long enough to gather proof. Clark hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. But you must be careful. Your son is controlling your medication personally. How will you avoid taking it? My husband was an actor, she replied, a faint smile ghosting her lips. He taught me tricks during our marriage. I can create a pocket under my tongue, make it look like I've swallowed. I'll keep the symptoms just visible enough to avoid suspicion. Back home that evening, Daniel entered her bedroom, carrying a glass of water and the pills, his face arranged into practiced concern. He stood over her as she placed them in her mouth, drank deeply, and swallowed. Or so it seemed. She let her hand tremble slightly as she set the glass down, spilling a few drops onto the blanket. You seem better tonight, Daniel said, studying her. She forced a thin smile. Just a momentary clarity, I suppose. They come and go. Satisfied, he leaned down to kiss her cheek before leaving. Only when the door clicked shut did Eleanor retrieve the damp tablets from beneath her tongue, tucking them into the hollowed spine of an architectural history book. Evidence for the day her trap would be sprung. Alone in the dim glow of her bedside lamp, Eleanor turned the pills over in her palm. Daniel had been feeding her death piece by piece, disguising it as care. He had underestimated the discipline of a woman who had spent half a century calculating weight loads and structural endurance. She knew how to build under pressure. She also knew how to wait. From that night forward, every performance mattered. At breakfast, she let her spoon clatter faintly against the saucer. In the afternoon, she stumbled against the banister just enough to remind Daniel she was fragile. At dinner, she let her fork hover in confusion before resuming. Always the actress, always the architect, sketching not blueprints, but strategy. Each day, Helen gathered the discarded pills. Each day, Eleanor wrote notes in precise lines. Each day, the foundation of Daniel's scheme began to crack beneath the weight of her quiet resistance. 3 weeks, she thought, tracing her fingers over the empty drafting table where her greatest designs once came alive. 3 weeks to collect proof. 3 weeks to build a fortress no betrayal could breach. For now, she wore her frailty like armor. But beneath the mask, Eleanor Grant was no longer the helpless mother Daniel believed her to be. She was a survivor with a plan, and the evidence of poison sat heavy in her palm like the blueprint of justice itself. Sometimes survival isn't about strength, it's about building a better plan. Eleanor Grant understood that now. Her son thought he was tightening a noose, but what he had really given her was time. And with time, an architect can design anything, even her own salvation. For weeks, she played her role with flawless precision. In the morning, she let her hand tremble as she raised the cup Daniel placed before her. At lunch, she drifted into silence long enough for Victoria to exchange satisfied glances with him. At night, she pretended confusion, staring at her medicine bottle as though the labels blurred into nothing. Behind the mask, Eleanor was wide awake. The pills Daniel pressed into her hand never made it past her tongue. Each one hidden, each one logged. Helen collected them and sealed them in small plastic bags, her handwriting noting the date, time, and description. Together, they built a shadow archive, evidence of a crime wrapped in the disguise of care. Richard Alvarez called late one evening, his voice low and steady. "I've arranged someone to meet you," he said. Discreet, trustworthy. His name is Patrick O'Connor, former Boston detective. He specializes in financial crimes against the elderly. If Daniel is draining your accounts, Patrick will find it. The meeting took place beneath the guise of physical therapy. Helen drove Eleanor to the clinic where they slipped out a side door into an unmarked car. Patrick was waiting, tall and broad, his eyes sharp with the kind of vigilance that never retires. "They've been methodical," Patrick explained after weeks of digging, spreading statements across the table of a quiet diner. At first, Daniel transferred small amounts, 10, 20,000 at a time. But once your health seemed to worsen, the amounts grew. Offshore accounts, layered through shell corporations. He's moved over 2 million already. Eleanor's fingers traced the numbers, not in shock but in recognition. She had spent her career studying patterns. Structural weaknesses, architectural failures, revealed themselves if you looked closely enough. Her son's greed was no different. It had its own blueprint, and now she could see it. "And Victoria?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was calm, though inside she braced herself. Patrick hesitated before sliding another folder across the table. Inside were photographs of Victoria with a man Eleanor didn't recognize. The two were seated too close, their hands too familiar. More disturbing were the documents they examined together. Blueprints of Eleanor's house, property valuations, lists of assets. "His name is Stephen Kaufman," Patrick said. "Luxury real estate broker. Victoria's been meeting him privately for months. Before she married your son, she was investigated in Boston for elder financial exploitation. Case collapsed when the victim died suddenly. The pieces clicked into place like steel beams locking into a frame. Daniel had married a predator, and together they had turned her home into their hunting ground." That night, Eleanor sat at her drafting table. Her hands shook as she lifted the pencil, but the tremor did not stop her. For decades, she had designed towers and cultural landmarks, lines on paper that became monuments of stone and glass. Now she sketched something different, a trap. Every structure began with a foundation. Hers was fragile but not broken. Her body still bore the scars of poisoning, moments of awe when words slipped away, hands that sometimes refused her will. But her mind remained clear, and clarity was enough. She could not confront them directly. Her strength would not allow it. But she could stage something greater. She could let their own ambition collapse upon them, the way a poorly designed building folds under its own flawed weight. The following morning, Daniel entered her room, medication in hand. Eleanor smiled weakly, letting her voice quiver. I was thinking, perhaps we should update my will, just in case. Best to keep everything in order. A flicker passed over his face, excitement too sharp to disguise. He nodded quickly. That's thoughtful, Mom. I'll call Henderson tomorrow. Henderson. Not her lawyer of 40 years, but Daniel's golfing companion. Another piece of his design. When he left, Eleanor spat the pills into her napkin and tucked them into the hollowed spine of her architectural history book. The evidence mounting day by day. She whispered to herself, steady and deliberate. Patience. Structure must be built carefully. As days turned into weeks, her double life became second nature. By daylight, she was frail, confused, compliant. By night, she was sharp, deliberate, precise. Helen stood beside her like a quiet sentinel, collecting evidence, keeping her secret. Patrick continued his investigations, peeling back layers of fraud. And Richard, steady as a cornerstone, reminded her that the Urban Hub project, the dream they had once abandoned, might now become her instrument of resurrection. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt not only alive, but purposeful. She was no longer a victim waiting for her son to decide her fate. She was an architect again, designing a future not of buildings, but of justice. And to those listening, let this be a warning. Never underestimate the strength of someone who knows how to build under pressure. Eleanor was not finished. Her story had only begun. If you're drawn into her fight for survival, stay with this journey. Like, share, and subscribe. Because the walls closing around her are about to crack wide open, and you won't want to miss what happens when they do. The March wind rattled bare branches outside Eleanor Grant's window as she prepared for her most daring meeting yet. Helen tightened the scarf around her neck before slipping her out the back door, a simple act that now felt like crossing enemy lines. To Daniel, Eleanor was napping upstairs, her body failing inch by inch. In truth, she was being driven to a downtown office where her survival would be drafted like an architectural plan. Jonathan Reeves, a formidable attorney with a reputation for dismantling schemes of financial abuse, stood as she entered. His office was lined with dark wood shelves stacked with case files and law journals, yet it felt to Eleanor like a war room. Jonathan studied the evidence she laid before him. Helen's notebook of altered prescriptions, Patrick's financial reports, and the growing collection of hidden pills. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of both caution and resolve. Mrs. Grant, what your son and daughter-in-law are doing isn't just betrayal. It's elder abuse, financial fraud, and potentially attempted homicide. I could walk this into the prosecutor's office today. Not yet, Eleanor replied firmly, her voice stronger than she had expected. If we confront them now, Daniel will twist the narrative. He'll call me confused, unwell, incapable. I need a case so airtight it leaves no room for doubt. And I want to make sure that when justice comes, they have nothing left to stand on. Jonathan leaned back, narrowing his eyes. What exactly do you have in mind? Eleanor outlined her vision with the precision of an architect sketching her most ambitious design. The creation of a foundation, one that would quietly take legal ownership of her property and assets. A structure built not of steel but of contracts, one that would preserve her legacy while leaving Daniel and Victoria powerless. She spoke of timing, of unveiling not just the truth of their crimes but the rebirth of her career through the long-dormant Urban Hub project. At first, Jonathan's expression carried skepticism, but as she detailed each step, admiration slowly replaced doubt. Unorthodox, he admitted at last, but elegant, legally sound if executed carefully, and difficult to contest once filed. It was all she needed to hear. Richard Alvarez waited in the car when she returned, his presence as steady as the beams of a cathedral. "You're taking substantial risks," he warned, guiding her back to the clinic where Helen would retrieve her. "I'm eliminating risk," she countered. "Every day I remain under their control is another day Daniel might accelerate his plan. The foundation, the urban hub, these aren't just projects. They're my shield." Her mind wandered briefly to the urban hub, the dream she and Richard had conceived decades earlier. A revolutionary model of sustainable living, it had been abandoned when she chose the traditional path of family over ambition. Now, in the ashes of betrayal, it returned not as a dream but as salvation. That weekend, while Daniel and Victoria attended a charity gala, Patrick installed surveillance equipment throughout the house. Micro cameras were hidden in light fixtures Eleanor herself had designed decades earlier. Audio devices were woven seamlessly into the intercom system. Every cavity, every conduit was a secret passage known only to the architect who had drawn them. The first recordings came quickly. Through the static of the intercom, Eleanor heard Daniel's voice low and impatient. "She's asking about updating her will. Should we adjust her medication again?" Dr. Robert Hale's answer slithered through the wire. "Careful, the current combination is already near maximum effect. We don't want suspicions triggered by a sudden decline. Natural progression is cleaner." Eleanor sat in her study, the faint glow of the desk lamp illuminating her trembling hands. Rage threatened to break her calm, but she forced herself into the discipline that had built towers from sketches. Structures failed when designed in haste. So did plans for justice. She looked down at her notes, a blueprint of another kind. The foundation paperwork nearly complete. The Carrington Group, now Whitman Development, waiting for her signature to move forward with Urban Hub. And Linda Zhao, a rising prosecutor with a reputation for integrity, quietly agreeing to review her case file. For weeks she continued the charade, her body weak only in appearance. She spilled water with trembling fingers, stumbled with convincing fragility, and feigned the fog of confusion. Yet in the quiet hours, she drafted contracts, reviewed evidence, and designed the stage upon which her son and his wife would expose themselves. One evening, Victoria entered her studio unannounced, her smile bright and rehearsed. "Eleanor, I was thinking, the anniversary of your first major commission is next month. What if we host a special dinner at the Palmer Club? James just secured a membership. It would be a wonderful way to celebrate you." Eleanor blinked with feigned confusion, masking the satisfaction that bloomed in her chest. They were planning her stage for her. "That would be lovely, dear," she answered, her voice weak but gracious. After Victoria left, Eleanor pressed a message into her phone for Helen. "They're planning their own event, May 15th. Perfect timing." As she set the phone aside, Eleanor gazed across the room at the architectural models that had defined her life. For decades, she had believed her greatest designs were behind her, but here, in the autumn of her years, she was building her most intricate structure yet. Not of glass and steel, but of justice, truth, and survival. And she would not allow it to collapse. There is a particular terror in knowing death is being poured into your veins by the very hands meant to protect you. Eleanor Grant lived with that terror every day, and yet she wore it like a veil, invisible to those who thought she was already defeated. What Daniel and Victoria never understood was that a woman who had built towers out of steel and vision could build something stronger than fear. She could build revenge. The surveillance system whispered their secrets into her studio at night. Eleanor sat with headphones pressed tight, listening as Daniel's voice slithered through the intercom. "She wants to change her will," he murmured, tension vibrating in every word. Dr. Hale's reply was calm, deliberate. "Patience, her decline must feel natural. If you push too fast, suspicion will follow." Daniel exhaled sharply. "The Westridge partnership is closing. I need access to her accounts now." "You'll have it," Hale assured, "soon." The fury that coursed through Eleanor's chest was tempered by discipline. She wrote notes in her steady hand, cross-referenced recordings with Helen's logs, and tucked everything away into her growing archive. Each page, each file, each hidden pill was a beam in the framework of her case. But fury alone was not enough. She needed precision. When Daniel entered her room the next morning, she let her lips tremble as she spoke. "Perhaps we should meet with Henderson soon. It would ease my mind to know the will is in order." The quick flash of eagerness in his eyes was more than confirmation. It was validation. Eleanor smiled faintly, feigning relief, while inside her heart pulsed with victory. Every trap must begin with bait, and Daniel had taken it eagerly. Meanwhile, Patrick O'Connor's investigation widened. He uncovered photographs of Victoria leaning too close to a real estate broker, documents spread before them like blueprints of a crime. Eleanor stared at the images with a detached calm. It no longer shocked her. Of course, Victoria was plotting a life beyond Daniel. Predators did not settle. They hunted until there was nothing left. That night, Eleanor's pencil moved across paper in slow, deliberate strokes. She no longer drew skylines or bridges. Instead, she sketched a stage. The Palmer Club dinner, the unveiling of her foundation, the trap that would bring Daniel and Victoria into the full light of exposure. Every detail mattered. Timing, presentation, witnesses. Just as a building stood or fell by its foundation, so too would this plan stand or fall by her ability to appear weak until the very last moment. Yet the mask grew heavier with each day. There were moments when her body betrayed her, when the poisoning's lingering fog swallowed her words, when her hand trembled too violently to hold a pen. But she had never abandoned a project mid-construction, and she would not abandon this. Helen became her quiet accomplice, slipping documents into folders, ensuring the surveillance system continued to capture evidence. "They think you're fading," Helen whispered one night as she helped Eleanor into bed. "But you've never been sharper." Eleanor touched her arm, gratitude filling her eyes. "You've given me more than loyalty, Helen. You've given me time." The following week, Victoria arrived with her practiced smile, her perfume thick and invasive. "Eleanor," she said sweetly, "wouldn't it be lovely if we hosted a dinner in your honor? The Palmer Club has such prestige. Daniel thinks it would mean so much to you." Eleanor let her eyes flicker with manufactured confusion, then softened into a grateful smile. "That would be wonderful, dear. How thoughtful of you." Inside, her heart pounded. The predators were building her stage with their own hands. They thought they were arranging her farewell. Instead, they were arranging their ruin. At night, Eleanor stared into the mirror above her vanity. The reflection that looked back at her was fragile, silver hair curled softly around her face, shoulders slumped as though under great weight. But when she straightened, when she let her gaze harden, she saw the woman she had once been. The architect whose designs shaped skylines. The visionary who defied every man who told her she could not. She whispered to her reflection, steady and sure, "You thought I was finished, but I am only beginning." For those listening now, remember this truth. When predators think they've cornered their prey, they never expect the prey to fight back with precision, patience, and purpose. Eleanor was not waiting to die. She was building the moment of their destruction. Stay with her. Like, share, and subscribe, because the cracks in this mask are not signs of weakness. They are the fractures through which her vengeance will break free. And when it does, everything Daniel and Victoria built will collapse around them. The Palmer Club gleamed beneath a canopy of chandeliers, its marble floors polished to a mirror's shine, its walls echoing with the hum of Chicago's elite. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved like clockwork, filling glasses and arranging silver trays. At the entrance, Daniel and Victoria Grant greeted guests with wide smiles, the picture of elegance and ambition. But Eleanor Grant was not there yet. She waited in Richard Alvarez's penthouse, where Helen fastened her mother's pearls around her neck. The woman staring back from the mirror bore little resemblance to the fragile widow Daniel paraded before the world. Eleanor's silver hair had been cut into a sleek, precise bob. Her dress, a deep crimson, fell in clean architectural lines that spoke of strength rather than frailty. For months she had hunched her shoulders, feigned tremors, and let confusion cloud her gaze. Tonight the mask was gone. "They won't recognize you," Richard said, his voice carrying both awe and warning. "That's the point," Eleanor replied. At precisely 9 o'clock, the maitre d' announced their arrival. The room stilled as heads turned. For an instant, silence replaced the soft clinking of glasses. Then came the rush of whispers. "Mrs. Grant? She looks incredible. Isn't she supposed to be ill?" Eleanor walked into the room with measured grace, her hand resting lightly on Richard's arm. Every step was deliberate, her posture straight, her chin lifted. She was no longer the fragile mother Daniel controlled. She was the architect who had once commanded the attention of international conferences. Daniel's face drained of color. Mother? His voice cracked on the word. He looked as though a ghost had stepped out of memory and into his party. Daniel, Victoria. Eleanor's smile was polite, cool. Thank you for arranging such a lovely evening. Victoria's painted lips twitched. You're looking well. Eleanor's eyes gleamed. Amazing what proper medication can do. The first course arrived, silver domes lifted to reveal flawless plates. Around the table, Daniel's colleagues congratulated him on his upcoming promotion to partner at West Ridge Development. He smiled, but the confidence that once dripped from his every gesture now flickered under strain. Each time he glanced at his mother, it was as though he was seeing a stranger. When dessert was served, Daniel rose, his champagne glass raised. Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement. Tonight, I am honored to share that I have been named partner at West Ridge Development Investment. Applause rippled through the room, though a few glances slid toward Eleanor, curiosity sparking. She waited for the applause to fade, then she stood. I too have an announcement. The room hushed instantly. From the entrance, a procession entered. Executives from Whitman Development, her attorneys, and finally Linda Zhao, a rising prosecutor with a portfolio of documents pressed to her chest. Eleanor's voice carried easily across the hushed dining hall. I am proud to announce the revival of the Urban Hub project, a $120 million development that will transform our city's industrial district into a model of sustainable living. Waiters moved like stagehands, delivering sleek portfolios to each place setting. Gasps fluttered as pages turned, revealing renderings and contracts signed in Eleanor's name. But that is not all. Eleanor's tone sharpened, slicing through the room's charged air. As of last month, the Grant Foundation for Young Architects is the legal owner of my residence, which will be preserved in perpetuity as an educational center. Victoria's glass froze midway to her lips. Daniel's smile faltered, then collapsed entirely. And finally, we saw Eleanor continued, her gaze sweeping the room. There are legal matters requiring immediate attention. She nodded to Linda Zhao, who stepped forward, her expression calm but unyielding. Papers slid across the table toward Daniel. Financial records, medical evidence, transcripts from hidden surveillance. His hands shook as he scanned the pages. This is ridiculous. His voice rose, cracking with panic. My mother is confused. She's been confused for months. Ask her doctor. Dr. Hale, Linda replied evenly, is currently under investigation by the medical board. His cooperation may reduce his own charges. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the faint scrape of chairs as guests shifted uncomfortably. Business partners who once leaned toward Daniel now leaned away. Victoria? Daniel turned, desperate, but Victoria was already calculating. Daniel handled all the medical decisions, she said quickly, her tone almost rehearsed. I was rarely involved. Linda opened her folder, revealing transcripts that contradicted her words line by line. Victoria paled, her practiced smile dissolving. One by one, the guests excused themselves, murmuring apologies as they departed. But the power in the room remained at Eleanor's side. The Whitman executives, Linda Zhao, her legal team. Daniel was left exposed, his fortress of control collapsing in the bright light of truth. You've just destroyed my career, he hissed, his voice low and venomous, as the last of his colleagues slipped away. No, Daniel, Eleanor said softly, her eyes steady. You destroyed it yourself the moment you decided my death was an acceptable price for your ambition. For the first time, he did not deny it. His silence was its own confession. The Palmer Club's chandeliers glittered above them, casting a cold light over the ruins of a son's betrayal. Eleanor stood taller than she had in years. She had spent months pretending to be broken. Tonight, she revealed the truth. She was not broken. She was unshakable. Betrayal has a way of hollowing a person out, but justice has a way of filling that emptiness with fire. Eleanor Grant knew this as she watched the fallout from the Palmer Club unfold. Each passing day exposing new fractures in the empire her son had built on lies. The morning after the dinner, headlines whispered across Chicago's business circles. Promising developer faces allegations. By the end of the week, whispers had become certainty. Daniel's promotion vanished like smoke. His phone calls went unanswered by former allies. His name, once carefully polished for prestige, now clung to words like fraud and abuse. Eleanor sat in her studio, the same space where Victoria once imagined her closet. Sunlight poured across the drafting table, catching on piles of documents now organized into precise stacks: financial records, transcripts, medical analyses. Evidence. Proof that her survival had not been luck, but design. Patrick O'Connor visited often, his folders thick with new findings. "The offshore transfers are frozen," he explained, his voice steady. 2.3 million locked down. He can't touch a cent. Eleanor traced the edges of the papers, her architect's eye always drawn to structure. "Money was never what I feared losing," she said softly. "It was my name, my work, my life." Patrick leaned forward. "You've secured all three. He can't take them now." And yet the battle was far from finished. Dr. Robert Hale's veneer of respectability crumbled as investigators uncovered a pattern. 3 wealthy patients, all elderly, all under his care, each death ruled natural, each estate conveniently redirected. What Daniel had believed a private scheme was in truth part of a wider predation. Hale's license was suspended within days. His face, once smiling on medical brochures, appeared instead in nightly news reports beside words like malpractice and poison. Victoria, ever the strategist, shifted like smoke in the wind. She painted herself as another victim, a wife misled, a woman manipulated. But Eleanor had the recordings, the transcripts where Victoria's voice dripped with anticipation, where she dreamed of turning Eleanor's home into her own palace. Those words would not vanish. And Daniel grew desperate. He appeared at Eleanor's door one evening, his eyes bloodshot, his smile strained thin. "Mother," he began, the words suddenly fragile. "We don't have to fight like this. We can make it right." Eleanor met his gaze, her voice cool as stone. "You tried to make it right by watching me die." For the first time he faltered, not because he felt guilt, but because he realized she no longer belonged to his control. She was beyond it, standing taller in her frailty than she had ever stood in her strength. Meanwhile, Eleanor's foundation took shape. The Grant Foundation for Young Architects secured its charter, its board filled with allies she trusted. Her home, once her prison, became a blueprint for the future, a place where students would study, design, and dream. The space Victoria coveted for shoes and gowns would instead hold drafting tables and models. Every corner that once echoed with betrayal would ring with creativity. And then came the urban hub. The project she and Richard Alvarez had abandoned decades earlier now rose again, no longer a dream deferred but a promise renewed. Contracts were signed, investors secured, renderings revealed to the press. Where Daniel and Victoria sought only to consume, Eleanor built. She created. She breathed life back into the city and into herself, but the cost lingered in her body. The poisoning had left shadows that even time could not erase. There were days when her right hand shook so badly she could barely hold a pencil. Nights when words dissolved on her tongue, slipping away before she could capture them. Yet she learned to live with these scars as an architect lives with the constraints of material and gravity. Limitations that did not destroy vision, but shaped it. She whispered to herself at her drafting table, "You are still building." To those listening now, hear this truth. Justice does not erase betrayal, but it transforms it. It takes the rubble of what was broken and forges something unshakable. Eleanor Grant was no longer a victim waiting for her end. She was a creator of her own reckoning, an architect of consequences. And if her story stirs something in you, if you believe no betrayal is greater than the will to rise above it, then stay with her. Like, share, and subscribe. Because Eleanor's fight is not finished, and the reckoning that began at the Palmer Club is only the foundation. The walls of her justice are still climbing, brick by unyielding brick. Summer sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Richard Alvarez's penthouse, catching the edges of Eleanor Grant's architectural sketches. The city stretched beyond the glass, alive with energy, while her hands moved slowly across paper, tracing lines that gave form to dreams once abandoned. Though her right hand trembled at times, though words occasionally escaped her memory, she pressed on. Vision had always been her truest strength. Across the table, Helen Brooks organized folders with her quiet efficiency. She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was the administrative director of the Grant Foundation, the steward of Eleanor's reborn legacy. Together, they transformed the house that Daniel and Victoria once sought to plunder. Drafting tables now stood where dining chairs had been. Shelves filled with reference books replaced cabinets once meant for china. The air smelled not of perfume or polish, but of graphite, ink, and ambition. The foundation opened its doors to its first class of scholarship students that June. Young men and women, bright-eyed and determined, filled Eleanor's home with laughter and fresh ideas. She walked among them with a cane for balance, her steps slower, but her presence commanding. They treated her not as a fragile relic, but as a living mentor. One student, a girl named Sophia, lifted her sketchbook one afternoon and said softly, "Mrs. Grant, I never thought I'd study architecture in a place like this. My family couldn't have afforded it." Eleanor placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. "Dreams belong to those who dare build them, Sophia. That is all architecture really is. The courage to shape space into meaning." Those words lingered long after she returned to her studio, for they reminded her that legacy was never about possessions. It was about creating something that breathed beyond your own lifetime. Meanwhile, Daniel's downfall deepened. His accounts frozen, his promotion gone, his reputation shattered. He drifted into obscurity. The son who once paraded her weakness now stood accused. His name whispered not with admiration but pity and contempt. From his rented apartment, he sent letters pleading for reconciliation, each one a mixture of excuses and half-truths. Eleanor read them with the cool detachment of an architect studying a failed design. The foundation was flawed, the structure unsalvageable. Victoria fared little better. Abandoned by the allies she once charmed, she sought to cut a deal with prosecutors, offering her cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. But the surveillance recordings, her own words dripping with calculation, were too damning. Even her beauty, once her greatest tool, had dulled under the weight of exposure. In Dr. Hale, he faced not just disgrace but ruin. His license revoked, his name etched into the annals of medical betrayal, he now stood as proof of how ambition and greed could twist healing into harm. Eleanor thought of the other elderly victims whose stories might never be told, and she vowed their silence would not be in vain. Through it all, Richard remained by her side. Their relationship had shifted into something both unexpected and inevitable. Not romance, not exactly, but a partnership of equals bound by unfinished dreams. He drove her to meetings with Whitman Development, where executives praised her designs for Urban Hub. He steadied her arm when vertigo struck, then stepped back when she needed to stand alone. He was not her savior. He was her witness, her collaborator, her anchor. One evening, after a long day of reviewing project timelines, Richard poured them each a glass of wine on his terrace. The lake shimmered under the fading light. "You've built something extraordinary again," he said quietly. "Not just the foundation, not just Urban Hub, yourself." Eleanor looked out over the water, her reflection caught in the glass. "Extraordinary things are never built alone. You, Helen, Patrick, Linda, you've all been part of the structure." He studied her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Still, it was your blueprint." She did not answer. She didn't need to. That night, unable to sleep, she returned to her drafting table. Her hands shook as she lifted the pencil, but when it touched paper, the line steadied. She drew not just buildings, but pathways, plazas, and green spaces, the living heart of Urban Hub. For the first time in years, she felt the kind of creative fire that had defined her youth. She whispered into the silence of the room, her voice soft but certain. "You thought you ended me. Instead, you gave me reason to begin again." The betrayal had scarred her, yes, her body still carried its shadows. But scars were proof of survival, and survival had given her something far greater than revenge. It had given her renewal. Eleanor Grant was not simply rebuilding her legacy, she was redesigning her life. Winter sunlight poured across the courtyard of the newly inaugurated Grant Foundation for Young Architects. The engraved stone plaque gleamed in the cold air. "Established 2026, a legacy of vision." Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and 20 scholarship students stood proudly behind Eleanor Grant, their sketchbooks tucked under their arms. The house that Daniel and Victoria once schemed to possess had been transformed. Where the dining room once echoed with whispers of betrayal, a lecture hall now stood. Her studio, once targeted as a closet, brimmed with drafting tables and glowing computer screens. Every corner carried the pulse of creation. Mrs. Grant, a reporter called, how does it feel to see your home reborn as a place of learning? Eleanor steadied herself against her cane, her voice strong. Architecture is about transformation. Once this house was a sanctuary, then a battleground. Today it is a legacy, not of what was taken, but of what was built. Beside her, Helen Brooks beamed with quiet pride. Once a housekeeper, now the administrative heart of the foundation, Helen had become proof that loyalty could endure where blood had failed. In the months that followed, Eleanor's days filled with new rhythms, meetings with developers, studio critiques with students, evenings on Richard Alvarez's terrace, where the city lights mirrored the constellations. Her body still carried reminders of the poisoning, occasional tremors, sudden lapses of energy, but these were no longer curses. They were simply part of her design, limitations that shaped her pace but not her vision. Daniel's trial ended in a guilty plea, 8 years in federal prison, with parole possible after 5. Victoria, sentenced to 3, attempted to paint herself as a victim, but the recording sealed her complicity. Dr. Robert Hale, stripped of his license, faced 6 years and the shame of being branded not as a healer, but a predator. When news broke of the sentences, Eleanor felt no triumph, only a quiet stillness. Justice had come, slow and deliberate, like a building rising floor by floor until the structure stood complete. She thought of Daniel not as a son anymore, but as a ruin, an edifice whose foundation was so deeply flawed that no renovation could ever save it. But where he crumbled, she flourished. Urban Hub broke ground with Whitman Development, hailed as a visionary model of sustainable design. The city's papers described her not as a survivor of scandal, but as the architect of renewal. Students from her foundation walked construction sites with her, their voices bright with ideas she once feared would never find a future. On the 2nd anniversary of that bitter birthday, Eleanor hosted a gathering at her new lakeside home, a modernist structure of glass, steel, and warm wood, designed to accommodate her physical limitations without sacrificing elegance. From the terrace, the Chicago skyline rose against the horizon, some buildings her own creations from decades earlier, others the works of architects she had once mentored. To Eleanor, Thomas Whitman declared, raising his glass, whose vision has not only reshaped our city, but redefined what it means to endure. Applause echoed across the terrace. Eleanor lifted her own glass, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hand. We build not just with stone and steel, but with trust, purpose, and resilience. Tonight I toast not to what I have survived, but to what we have built together. As the gathering thinned, she lingered by the lake with Richard. The moonlight shimmered across the water, silver against the black expanse. He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that was neither romantic nor merely friendly. Something deeper, forged in shared survival. Any regrets? He asked quietly. Eleanor gazed at the skyline, at the students laughing inside her home, at the future unfolding despite the shadows of the past. Only that I didn't begin sooner, she admitted, but I suppose some structures can only rise after the old ones collapse. Richard nodded, silent in agreement. Eleanor turned back to the water, her reflection fractured by ripples but unbroken. She had been poisoned, betrayed, nearly erased. But she had rebuilt, not just her legacy, but her life. And to you listening now, remember this truth. It is never too late to redesign your story. No betrayal, no weakness, no failure is final unless you let it be. Like, share, and subscribe, and carry this with you, because the most important structures we ever build are not towers of glass, but the lives we create from the ruins.